Before the world decides what you are, before it measures you against a doorframe or a man's pride, there is the moment you choose whether to bend or stand. This is a story about standing. About a woman who arrived with a suitcase, a promise, and a heart that refused to be made smaller. What happened next would change a town that never expected her to stay. The train screamed its arrival into Silver Creek, metal shrieking against metal as steam burst into the frozen afternoon like a living thing. The platform shuddered beneath iron wheels, and the sound echoed off the pine-covered hills surrounding the town. Ella Lanina Morgan stepped down from the final car with a single, well-worn suitcase clenched in her gloved hand. She stood tall, impossibly tall by most measures, her 6-foot frame casting a long, unmistakable shadow across the warped wooden boards of the platform. Back in Boston, that shadow had followed her everywhere, stretching across drawing rooms and church aisles, collecting glances, whispers, and the occasional cruel joke. Men had called her impressive when they meant intimidating, and women had smiled tightly when they meant uncomfortable. She had learned young to hold her shoulders back anyway, to meet eyes instead of dropping them, to take up the space her body demanded whether the world liked it or not. She had not come west for approval. She had come because the letter folded, carefully inside her coat. Pocket had promised something better. For 6 months she had exchanged careful, measured letters with William Prescott, a sawmill owner in Oregon, territory whose handwriting was neat and whose tone was steady and polite. He wrote of timber shipments and weather patterns, of the need for a capable wife in a growing town, of evenings spent reading by lamplight. He had never asked about her height. She had never mentioned it. Instead, they talked about soups that could stretch through winter, about books they both admired, about the quiet satisfaction of honest work. It had felt safe, and safety, she had learned, was not something to dismiss lightly. Now, as the train's final whistle faded and the engine hissed into silence, Ella smoothed the front of her forest green wool dress, handmade and sturdy, and drew in a steadying breath. This was supposed to be the beginning. Silver Creek lay before her like a rough sketch of a town, carved from pine and persistence. Mud coated the streets in uneven ruts. Signs hung crooked over the general store and saloon. A church with peeling white paint stood slightly apart, its steeple leaning as if tired from holding itself upright. A handful of loggers lounged outside the saloon, boots braced against the railing, their low conversation stalling as Ella passed. One of them let out a long, low whistle when he realized just how tall she was. Another laughed under his breath. She did not slow her pace. She had endured worse than idle men with too much time. A man stepped out from the general store and pulled off his hat as he approached, his movement hesitant, as though he were reconsidering with every step. He was solidly built, sandy-haired, his beard neatly trimmed, but when he stopped in front of her, she could see the truth immediately. He did not reach her chin. "Miss Morgan?" he asked, though uncertainty already edged his voice. "Mr. Prescott," she replied calmly, extending her gloved hand as she had practiced in her mind a dozen times during the journey. "It's good to finally meet you." He took her hand, his grip brief and awkward, and released it almost immediately. His eyes flicked from her face to her boots and back again, lingering just long enough to make the judgment unmistakable. "You didn't mention your stature," he said. She met his gaze without flinching. "No, I didn't." He shifted his weight, clearing his throat. "You're taller than me." "Yes," she said simply. "I am." He took a step back, as though the space between them had suddenly become dangerous. "I need a wife who fits the role," he said. The words landed heavier than the suitcase in her hand. "The role?" she echoed, her voice still even. He glanced toward the saloon, then back at her, his jaw tightening. "A woman should look up to her husband," he muttered, "not the other way around." Laughter drifted from behind him, someone enjoying the spectacle more than they bothered to hide. Ella straightened further, if that were possible. "You wrote that you wanted a partner," she said. "Someone to build a life with." "I wanted a normal woman," he replied, then winced as if the word had escaped before he could soften it. "Someone of ordinary stature." She did not raise her voice.
She did not cry.
She felt the crack inside her chest, sharp and sudden, but she did not let it show. "I spent everything I had to get here," she said quietly. He was already backing away. "I'll arrange your return passage," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The eastbound train comes through in the morning. I can't afford to leave," she said. He hesitated only a moment. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, already turning back toward the store. Truly, and just like that, the man who had promised her a future vanished into a building that suddenly felt like a wall. The loggers were still watching. One leaned forward and called out, "Need help with that bag, miss? Looks tiny in those big hands." More laughter followed. Ella did not respond. She stepped down from the platform into the mud, her boots sinking slightly with each step. Her suitcase felt heavier now, not because its contents had changed, but because hope had weight when it fell. She carried it the same way she always had, without complaint, past the general store, past the saloon, past the quiet church, and toward the edge of town where the pines stood tall and close together, their presence steady and indifferent. She set the suitcase down beside a fallen log and sat, her breath clouding in the cold air. The silence settled around her, broken only by the distant creak of signs and the soft whisper of wind through needles. For the first time since stepping off the train, she allowed herself to feel the sting fully. Then a voice came from behind her, unhurried and calm.
Quite a view from up here, huh?
She turned sharply. A man stood a few yards away, arms crossed, sleeves rolled up against the cold. He was taller than she was by a few inches. Broad-shouldered, his beard thick and dark, his eyes an unexpected clear blue. There was no surprise in his expression, no judgment, only quiet curiosity. "I didn't mean to sneak up," he said. "Name's Gabriel Blackwood. I run the northern logging camp." She studied him for a moment, wary but attentive. "There's a boarding house run by Martha Webb," he continued. "Decent beds, hot meals. I can walk you there if you'd like." "Why would you help me?" she asked honestly. He shrugged. "Because no one deserves to be left stranded, and because folks who don't fit the mold tend to change things, whether they mean to or not." She considered that, then nodded once. "All right, Mr. Blackwood." "Gabriel," he corrected gently. They walked back toward the lights of Silver Creek together, and though she could feel eyes following her, the weight of them felt lighter with someone at her side. That night, she slept under a heavy quilt in a small room at Webb's boarding house, the scent of soap and old wood around her, and for the first time since arriving, she did not feel entirely alone. Morning brought pale sunlight through thin curtains and the smell of coffee strong enough to coax her from bed. Martha Webb greeted her with a smile that reached her eyes, in a kitchen warm with bacon and bread. "You don't need to stoop here," Martha said cheerfully when Ella ducked out of habit. "My husband was tall as a pine, had the doors raised when we built this place." That simple kindness stayed with her. By mid-morning, Ella had unpacked her sewing kit into a small back room flooded with light, and by noon, women were already bringing garments in need of mending. Her hands remembered the work as if they had never stopped. When Gabriel returned briefly to check on her, offering steady work for his men's torn gear, she accepted, surprised by how quickly purpose took root. Days blurred into stitches and thread, into whispers and stares she learned again to ignore. When Saturday came with a sky scrubbed clean and the church social filled the hall with music and laughter, she stood before the mirror in her best dress and chose, deliberately, not to shrink. When she entered the hall, the room stilled, then shifted, and she held herself steady through it. Gabriel arrived later, tall and awkward in his pressed shirt, and when he asked her to dance, she took his hand. For the first time, she did not have to look down. They moved together easily, equally, and something inside her loosened. William Prescott's interruption came and went. His small cruelty met with her calm truth, and when Gabriel walked her home beneath a silvered moon, she felt something begin that she did not yet name. In the days that followed, work increased, confidence grew, and the town adjusted in small, reluctant ways. She did not know yet how deeply Silver Creek would test her resolve, how storms both literal and human would come, but as she stitched late into the evening with purpose in her hands and warmth in her chest, she knew one thing with certainty: she was done apologizing for the space she occupied. The winter settled into Silver Creek the way truth often does, slowly at first, then all at once, until everything familiar looked different under its weight. Snow began to cling to the rooftops and fence posts, softening the hard lines of the town without easing the watchful eyes that followed Ella Lanina Morgan wherever she went. She rose early each morning, the boarding house still quiet except for the creak of old wood and the low murmur of Martha Webb humming to herself as she worked the stove. Ella took her coffee standing, shoulders straight, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth, then retreated to the small sewing room that had become her sanctuary. Light poured in through the window even on gray days, reflecting off needles and thread, off wool and cotton stacked with care. Her fingers moved with confidence now, measuring, cutting, stitching garments that carried the marks of hard lives lived outdoors. Torn sleeves from axes swung too wide, split seams from shoulders too broad, hems frayed by constant work. Each repair was quiet proof that she belonged here, whether the town was ready to admit it or not. Word spread faster than she expected. By the end of the first week, men from the northern camp were dropping off bundles tied with twine, hats pulled low, eyes flicking up with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They did not comment on her height. They commented on her stitches. That suited her just fine. Gabriel Blackwood returned to camp the morning after the church social, his departure leaving a noticeable absence she refused to dwell on. He left behind only a brief note written in that same plain, confident hand. "You dance better than most men swing an axe. I'll be back soon. Until then, keep standing tall." She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pattern book, telling herself it was foolish to reread it as often as she did. Days passed, then more days, each one colder than the last. Frost traced delicate patterns along the boarding house windows at dawn. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys, and the smell of burning pine followed Ella through town. The stares never fully stopped, but they shifted. Some held curiosity instead of mockery now. Others carried something closer to approval, though it was cautious and slow to surface. She learned which shops welcomed her and which tolerated her presence out of necessity. She learned the rhythm of Silver Creek, its silences and its small kindnesses, its unspoken rules. She learned, too, that William Prescott did not look away when she passed anymore. His gaze lingered, sharp and measuring, as though he were waiting for her to stumble. She did not give him the satisfaction. The second Saturday arrived, wrapped in a storm that rolled down from the mountains with little warning. Snow fell thick and heavy, swallowing sound, turning roads into shifting white paths. By mid-afternoon, the town had retreated indoors, doors barred against the cold, lanterns glowing faintly through frosted glass. Ella worked until her fingers ached, then set her sewing aside and joined Martha in the kitchen, helping prepare stew that simmered all day, filling the house with warmth and spice. Every so often, she found her eyes drifting to the window, to the road beyond it, though she told herself there was no reason for it. Gabriel had said he would return. He was a man of his word. Evening settled early. Wind howled around the eaves, rattling shutters, and snow piled high against the porch steps. Ella was seated near the parlor window, mending a coat by lamplight, when 3 sharp knocks cut through the storm. Martha rose immediately, wiping her hands on her apron as she went to the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying snow and urgency with it. A young man stood on the threshold, his face red with cold, his coat stiff with ice. Ella recognized him as one of Gabriel's men. "Miss Morgan?" he asked, his voice strained. She was on her feet before he finished. "It's Mr. Blackwood," he said quickly. "There's been an accident." The room seemed to tilt. Her breath caught, sharp and painful. "He's alive," the man added, seeing the color drain from her face. "But he's hurt bad." Trees slid on Raven Ridge. He got the others clear, but his horse went down, and he couldn't make it out himself. Martha was already reaching for her medical bag, her expression grim but steady. Ella did not ask questions. She pulled on her boots and coat with hands that trembled, despite her efforts to still them. Snow came down in thick sheets as they hurried through town, the world reduced to white and shadow. Dr. Phillips's house glowed like a beacon against the storm. Inside, heat pressed in on her, heavy with the sense of blood, pine sap, and antiseptic. 4 loggers stood near the fire, hats clutched in their hands, faces drawn tight with worry. Mary Simmons moved among them, her apron stained, her expression controlled but weary. She turned when she saw Ella. "He's asking for you," Mary said quietly. Just for a moment, Ella nodded and stepped into the back room. Gabriel lay on a narrow cot, his broad frame barely contained by it. Bandages wrapped his torso and head, his legs splinted and elevated, the wool blanket beneath him darkened with dried blood. His face was pale, but his eyes, when they found her, were still unmistakably his. "You came," he said hoarsely. She crossed the room in 2 strides and took his hand, careful of the injuries. "Of course I did," she whispered. He attempted a smile and failed. "Not as bad as it looks," he said, then winced. "You're a terrible liar," she murmured, brushing damp hair back from his forehead. "Stick to logging." He huffed out a quiet laugh that ended in a hiss of pain. The storm roared outside, the fire crackled nearby, and for a long moment they said nothing more. When Dr. Phillips entered and gently insisted Gabriel needed rest, Ella rose reluctantly. Gabriel's fingers tightened around hers. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "I'll be back every day," she replied, her voice firm. And she was. She came with bread, with books, with quiet companionship that asked nothing and gave everything. Gabriel healed slowly, stubbornly. Fever never took him, and each day brought small improvements. They talked when he had strength, shared silence when he did not. She mended clothes at his bedside, the familiar rhythm grounding them both. Mary Simmons watched from the edges, her gaze thoughtful. She did not interfere, but Ella could feel the history in the room, unspoken and heavy. Whispers followed Ella again as the days passed. A single woman visiting an injured man every day gave the town something new to chew on. Martha dismissed it with sharp words and sharper looks. But Ella felt the weight of it anyway. William Prescott's presence grew more pointed. His comments, when they crossed paths, were smooth and cutting, meant to undermine without drawing open censure. She endured them with the same quiet strength she had always relied on. On the 18th day, Dr. Phillips declared Gabriel stable enough to move. Martha offered the boarding house without hesitation, preparing the back parlor with care. When Gabriel was carried in by his men, grumbling and embarrassed, Ella busied herself with linens and pillows, refusing to acknowledge the knot of worry and something warmer tightening in her chest. His recovery tested them both. He grew restless, chafing against stillness, while she stood firm, insisting on patience he did not enjoy. They played cards on long afternoons, laughed at bad jokes, shared stories that edged closer to confession without quite crossing the line. Snow fell steadily outside, sealing them into a small, shared world. The knock that came one evening shattered the fragile peace. William Prescott stood on the porch, his coat immaculate, his smile thin. He spoke of town business, of votes and meetings missed, his words edged with threat. Ella rose to her full height beside Gabriel, her voice cold and unyielding when she answered him. William left with his intentions clear and his pride wounded. Gabriel watched her with something like awe. "You're not afraid," he said later. "No," she replied softly. "Not anymore." The vote came on a bitter Thursday. The town hall filled to bursting, tension humming like a live wire. Gabriel spoke from his chair, his voice steady, laying bare the truth of land and loss. Then Ella stood. She spoke not as an outsider, begging acceptance, but as a woman who had chosen this place and been shaped by it. Her words cut clean and true. When the council returned and announced their decision against the northern expansion, relief swept the room. They had won, but more than that, something had shifted. In the days that followed, the town's edges softened. Women brought food and fabric.
Children waved.
Ella continued her work, continued to stand beside Gabriel as he healed, knowing the hardest parts were not yet behind them, but also knowing she would not face them alone. The weeks that followed the vote carried Silver Creek toward a different kind of winter, one less about survival and more about reckoning. Snow still lay thick on the rooftops and along the roads, but beneath it something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Ella Lanina Morgan felt it each morning when she stepped into the street and no longer sensed every gaze sharpen into judgment. People still noticed her height, still looked twice, but now there was something else there too. Respect earned not by shrinking herself, but by standing where it mattered. Gabriel remained at the boarding house under Martha Webb's watchful eye, his recovery slow but steady. He hated the confinement, the way his body refused to obey him the way it once had. But Ella met his frustration with patience and humor, reminding him that forests did not grow overnight and neither did bones mend. Their days fell into a quiet rhythm. Mornings brought light and coffee, the creak of the house waking around them. Ella stitched in the parlor while Gabriel read or dozed, occasionally interrupting, her concentration with a comment that made her smile despite herself. Afternoons brought visitors, men from the camp checking in on their foreman, townsfolk dropping by under the guise of concern, but lingering longer than necessary, curious about the partnership unfolding in plain sight. Evenings were softer. Sometimes they talked until the fire burned low, sharing pieces of themselves they had never quite put into words before. Gabriel spoke of the first winter he'd spent in Silver Creek, half-starved and stubborn, refusing to leave even when it would have been easier. Ella told him of Boston, of door frames ducked under and dances declined, of learning early that love often came with conditions she refused to meet. He listened without interrupting, his attention unwavering. That alone felt like a gift. Not everyone welcomed the change. William Prescott grew more bitter as his influence waned. The failed expansion vote had cost him allies, and every time he saw Ella and Gabriel together, something dark flickered behind his polite smiles. He began to spread his discontent quietly, suggesting that Gabriel's injury had softened his judgment, that Ella's presence was a distraction. That tradition was being eroded by sentiment. The town listened, as towns always do, but the words no longer landed as cleanly as William hoped. Too many people had seen Gabriel carried in from the storm, had seen Ella walking beside him every day after. Too many had benefited from her work, her steadiness, her refusal to bend. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt into slush and the promise of spring hovered faintly in the air, Gabriel stood from the couch without his crutch for the first time. The effort left him pale and shaking, but he did not fall. Ella was there in an instant, one hand firm at his arm, her presence anchoring him. He laughed breathlessly, a sound full of triumph and relief. "Don't get ahead of yourself," she warned, though her eyes shone. "I won't," he said, "but I'm getting there." Word of his progress spread quickly. The camp prepared for his return, slower work at first, lighter duties until his strength fully returned. Ella felt the approaching change keenly. Their days together in the boarding house were numbered, and though she would never wish him back into danger, the thought of that closeness ending tightened something in her chest. She did not speak of it, neither did he. The town's thaw continued. Children began to race through the streets again, boots splashing through puddles. The church rang its bell more often, marking weddings and births. Ella's sewing room grew busier than ever. She hired a young widow to help with cutting and pressing, surprised at how natural it felt to lead, to build something of her own. One evening, Martha watched her tally accounts and smiled knowingly. "You've put roots down," she said. Ella paused, considering. "I think I have." The final confrontation came without warning. William Prescott cornered Ella outside the general store one gray afternoon, his voice low and sharp. He spoke of mistakes and reputation, of how easily favor could turn, how precarious her position truly was. She listened until he finished, then looked down at him calmly. "You made your choice the day you decided I was too much," she said. "I've made mine since." He left her there, his anger thinly veiled, and she felt no fear watching him go. The day Gabriel returned to the camp was bright and cold, the air smelling of thawing earth and pine sap. Ella stood with him at the edge of town, her hands tucked into her coat pockets to keep them from trembling. He leaned on his crutch, taller than ever, his presence solid despite the scars that would never quite fade. "I won't be gone long," he said. "I know," she replied. He hesitated, then took her hand openly, there in the street where anyone could see. "When this is done," he said quietly, "when I'm steady again, I want to talk about what comes next. For both of us." She met his gaze, her heart full and steady. "So do I." He left with his men, and though the space beside her felt suddenly wide, it did not feel empty. She returned to her work, to her life, carrying with her the knowledge that love, real love, did not ask her to shrink. Spring arrived slowly, green pushing through stubborn snow, the forest waking around. Silver Creek. Gabriel returned stronger, his stride confident once more. He did not hesitate when he walked into the boarding house one evening and asked Ella to walk with him beyond the town, to the edge of the pines where she had once sat alone with a suitcase and a broken promise. There, beneath tall trees that did not apologize for their height, he told her plainly that he loved her, that he admired her strength, her honesty, her refusal to be anything other than herself. She answered him just as plainly. They stood together, equal in every way that mattered, and the forest bore witness. Silver Creek would remember her for many things in the years to come, for her skill, her courage, her unwavering presence. But Ella Lanina Morgan knew the truth that mattered most. She had come west seeking a place to belong. She had found it not by fitting a role, but by redefining it, standing tall until the world learned to meet her where she stood.